Before I introduce the next session speakers, I'd like to introduce Caroline from Foam Magazine, who has a short announcement about a conference that they're doing, which is coming up in a few weeks.
Thank you, Arthur, for giving me the time. I'm from Foam Magazine in Amsterdam, and we're also a photography museum, so maybe some of you might be familiar with what we're doing. I wanted to announce we're hosting this year a project called What's Next, and going basically on the future of photography. That's also why I'm here and very inspired by this great program of this 2 days conference. And I just wanted to bring to your attention, because of course I think you're the audience who might be interested in this whole dialogue. And basically what we want to do with Foam is giving a platform and to pose the question, okay, what's coming next? And we ask this to different people, artists, curators, writers, etc., to come up with a quite short statement and invite the public to react on those statements online. So I don't know, maybe I can show you quickly our website. And this is the first thing which came out with our magazine, and now comes like with every magazine we're printing or publishing quarterly. It's the booklet with those statements, and it's kind of the starting point for further discussions on foam.org, which is actually our website, /what's next. And now it should do the magic. I do not accept. Yes, I accept.
Maybe we could, you can show the website later.
Yeah, I mean, I can also show it absolutely later. Or you can have a look, please, at home and feel more than welcome and invited to respond and to send in questions you think they should be addressed and they're not yet addressed. You can very much recognize it by this horrible green, which will be visible on the website as well. And I have brought a couple of those booklets, but of course, because I only came with a very small, tiny suitcase, I have kind of 25. So if you're very interested, please feel free to get in touch with me and please visit the website. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Caroline. We'll show the website during the next break. So I'd like to welcome Anthony Aziz and Douglas Lanman up to the stage.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Arthur, for organizing this. Nice to see such a good turnout, especially students. Thank you. Is it possible to bring the lights down, please? There. Thanks. As we know, the urge to extend and enhance our biological vision has existed since the invention of optics. Until recently, there was a clear set of agreed-upon conditions that defined what can be called photographic vision, or photographic language, clearly described and prescribed by John Sarkowski in 1966 when he organized this exhibition at MoMA. His analysis and this show came to define the lexicon of high photographic modernism. In this, the post-photographic era, there are ever-expanding ways of defining this language. With new imaging software, we are now able to make possible the impossible, and I would argue not only extend our vision, but also our imaginations. In my work over the past 20 years, done in collaboration with Sami Kucher, who's here somewhere, who also teaches here in the School of Art, Media, and Technology at Parsons, I have created images and installations that attempt to represent this paradigm shift. When looking back at our practice, it can be broken down into 3 distinct phases. The first could be described as work that tries to represent the human figure in an age of technological anxiety. The second could be described as work that attempts to represent a kind of hypervisuality, a condition that allows for the viewer to see and to become part of what is seen at the same time. And thirdly, our most recent work, uses technology, humor, and our own personal histories to grapple with geopolitical conflict. For the sake of this discussion, I will focus only on the first two phases of our work. I will present a few slides of each and end with a short video clip of an installation we did at IBEAM in 2005. In San Francisco, I graduated from the Art Institute in 1990, where Sammy and I met. I just finished the program in photography, a department with a strong modernist legacy, the first photography department in a fine arts program started by Ansel Adams himself, who then brought in Edward Weston and Minor White. Upon graduating, there was a sudden shift in how we made, conceived, and received images. In a matter of just a few years, in the early 90s, conventional wisdom was turned inside out and upside down, and the Bay Area became a hotbed of startups, innovation, and utopic thinking about how images function in our lives and in our society. It was at this point that we felt compelled to understand the monumental changes that were sweeping through our senses. Essentially, the work that you're looking at, some of which you may recognize from 15 years ago, essentially it tried to grapple with and represent life as it was being co-opted by this new phenomenon called the internet. It's hard to imagine that it was actually once a new phenomenon, but in fact, that was the world that I was sort of being born into as Sammy and I were finishing our graduate program. This was the work that we became quite well known for, because this is the condition of the world as we knew it at that moment. And we wanted to create this set of images that somehow represented the developments as well as the corresponding loss that will occur with these developments. We're also very interested to represent the fetishization of handheld gadgets that we're all so comfortable with today. At that time, it still seemed like a very curious practice for all of us to be weighed down with numerous gadgets, and we decided to make this piece that addressed that kind of fetishization and the mystery and the power that lies behind them. And also to try and look at that line that was blurring between man and machine and continues to do so. A lot of the work at this time was actually a reaction to many of the stories that we were reading about and hearing about coming out of the Silicon Valley and MIT Media Lab and other research universities about smart living, smart houses, and smart cars. Science fiction was, in fact, becoming fact. Ultimately, all this work was meant to call into question the mad rush to the future. These images were made out of a critical concern for what makes us human, a principle that has guided all of our projects since. These images are of the interior series. They precede what became known as the Synaptic Bliss series. We're very interested in the relationship between the body and the space around us. So as we moved from representing images of the body itself, we decided to look at the way, through a series of prints and videos that I will show you, explores the impact of new technology has had on the way we perceive and experience time and space within this new paradigm. We were interested in trying to represent a digital consciousness that now exists, one that allows for the simultaneous perception of multiple perspectives and scales, as well as the blurring between the body and its environment, the exterior and the interior, the micro and the macro, the cells and the stars. The video that I want to show you was commissioned by the Parc de la Villette in Paris and was produced by IBEAM in New York, with invaluable management of the project by none other than our very own Melanie Crean, who teaches here at Parsons. All of the initial footage for the video for this piece was shot at the Parc de la Villette, and then it was composed with footage shot in our studio and with 3D animation sequences. Quite naturally, it emerged that one of the main themes of the work was the ability to travel very quickly between the outside landscape and the imaginary interior landscape, oftentimes having the experience of simultaneously inhabiting both worlds. The piece is meant to be contemplated as an electronic garden, its various movements evoking the four seasons, as well as the cycles of life in a world halfway between the organic and the digital. So I'm just going to shift to the video, which I think is right here. And I'm just going to show you first a shot of how it was installed at iBeam. Is there sound to it? So this just shows you the installation version of how the four screens were. It was meant to be an immersive experience. The first time we did this in Paris, the four screens were entirely around you as a cube, so you had to enter into the image. And the second version, when we installed it here in New York, we decided to do the four screens more that were partially immersive, and also so it put the viewer in a position where you're looking at the image and you're in it at the same time. So I'm just going to jump ahead to a section of this installation. It's an 18-minute, 4-channel piece. So I'm just going to show you one section that will give you, I hope, a sense of some of the things that I'm describing. So that's just a clip of an 18-minute piece. And I'd just like to leave you with one last thought, which is, even though this conference and a lot of the work that we have done over the years is so much about how we see it, it's really a much bigger concern based on what we heard this morning and what we're all aware of with surveillance and GPS tracking systems and so on about how we're seen. And I think that's really what we need to be focusing on going forward. So thank you.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Doug Lanman. I'm a postdoc, which for those of you who don't know is basically a research scientist at the Media Lab, and I'll be discussing some of the work we're doing as engineers to try to advance the photographic medium. And a lot of this is really targeted more towards novices, not experts such as yourselves, and basically asking the questions of whether we can remove all the knobs on a camera so that absolutely no technical skill is required. So let me just dive in. Of course, it's overly pedantic to try to explain to those of you in the room what a camera is. I guess what I'd like to say is, as an engineer, when I look at a camera, I see a device that hasn't really changed in over 100 years. At a very basic level, a modern digital SLR is a film camera with the film plane replaced by a digital sensor. And as a result, many of the classic training that you would need to operate a camera hasn't changed. Basically, you have a sensor, a lens, and an aperture. And you need to choose the parameters to produce a correct photographic print. And so that leads to all the technical training you might receive on choosing f numbers, exposure, depth of field, etc. Now, I think one interesting point to make here is that the cameras that we have today are really inspired by biological vision, and in particular human vision. Why is it that we have a 3-color camera? That's all a human needs to see the world. Why is it that it has one sensor, a lens, and an aperture? Well, that's pretty much what the eye has. But I think at a deeper level, a camera is a recording device. And its goal is to make a visual record of the world and ultimately to allow that record to be analyzed, modified, or displayed. And so I think to an engineer, ignoring the artistic aspects of a camera is just a communication device. And as a result, you can apply formal methods to maximize the amount of information it transmits through the world. It's a record of the past transmitted to the present or the future. And so I think even if we start with biological vision, we have to realize that nature has given us much more wonderful cameras than the human eye. We have 2 eyes, binocular vision. We see 3 color channels, and we can barely perceive polarization. I highly recommend you look this up. It's called Haddinger's brush. You can actually see the polarization on this screen once you learn how to do this trick. But more importantly, a mantis shrimp is far more impressive than our own eyes. Mantis shrimp, each individual eye, each eye on a stalk here, has trinocular vision, 3 cameras per eye. Each eye can also see 12 colors compared to our modest 3, spanning a wider range of electromagnetic spectrum. And beyond that, it can see 4 different states of polarization of light, and we can see none. And so I think the idea here is that we need to build cameras that far exceed biological human vision. We need to build these superhuman cameras we talked about earlier, not only to give us more power in post, but also to extend our own capabilities. And so here I'll just show you some of the work we're doing at the Media Lab as engineers to try to further this goal of building superhuman cameras. So we started about 5-6 years ago in a field called computational photography. And the basic theme we're using is to say Photoshop can only take us so far. When we use software, we have certain physical limits we cannot surpass. And so really the key idea in our group is to hack both the camera and the software together, not one by itself, to overcome traditional limitations. And so I'll just show you several projects along this theme. And so this is very indicative of work at the Media Lab. We took a camera off the shelf, ripped it apart, and what we've added right here is a ferroelectric shutter. So you can think of this as a single pixel that can be operated at high speed. The animation is missing, but what happens in this camera is when you take a single exposure, the aperture rapidly opens and closes over the exposure time, thousands of times. And so you might initially think, well, that's a stupid idea. Why would I want to lose light? Well, it turns out by losing light in a careful way, you can actually gain more power in post-production. And so here is a traditional photograph. So here we have a toy train moving from right to left, very simple exposure. You press the shutter, it opens, and then it closes. And as a result, you have a motion blur. All of you have probably encountered this. You can go into Photoshop and try to de-blur, right? And so actually in the 1980s, there were many PhD theses going from a blurred, motion-blurred image to a de-blurred photograph. But even using state-of-the-art methods, which this is, you end up with noise and ringing artifacts. And so I think what's interesting here, I don't have time to go into the technical depth, but by modulating the exposure thousands of times over a single exposure, we can get a photograph that still looks blurred. It's actually dimmer. So we gave up some light. But it turns out the deblurring algorithms can do much better. And so this is the idea of computational photography. We're mucking with both the hardware itself as well as the algorithm. And it turns out the algorithms become simpler when you design the hardware properly. So that's the theme of engineering. And so then being researchers, one of our main products besides patents are papers. That's how we stake our reputation. And so as soon as we had this idea, we tried to run with it as fast as possible. And so a lot of these ideas just take a conventional camera, nothing so inspired as a mantis shrimp eye, and try playing around with different planes. So I talked about exposure. It turns out you can rip open an SLR and remove the aperture, remove the iris plane, and replace it with a printed pattern. Right? And this mask actually allows you to do something very interesting. So if I take a camera and I focus it properly on, say, a point light source, I just see the point spread function, a nice point. When I throw the camera out of focus, I see what's known as the circle of confusion, or the bokeh of the camera. Now, I think what's interesting, you could try to think to yourself, what would happen if I put this pattern into the aperture of the camera? Well, I'll show you the result. You end up getting a circle, a bokeh pattern, which is basically a scaled version of this pattern you put in the camera. And it turns out the mathematics now, instead of removing motion blur, it allows you to refocus a photo. And so here's a very poorly taken photo, and you can see that we happen to get the focus wrong. We focused on the wrong subject. In Photoshop, you'd sort of be out of luck. You'd have noise and ringing. You can't change the plane of focus after the fact very well. Well, it turns out with a coded aperture, once again, we gave up light, but we gained the ability to change the plane of focus. So you can see that the glint on the eye can be restored. Now, we didn't take a second photograph. This is the original photograph corrected in software by modifying the camera hardware itself. And so this theme just keeps going. So this field started about 10 years ago with light field photography, and it's sort of been moving very quickly since. But the idea is that, like I said earlier, a camera for the longest time has been a sensor, a lens, and an aperture. And we're trying to break that assumption and not be inspired by biology anymore. So it turns out if you take a sensor and coat it with small lenses, or what we like to do instead is take a medium format camera and put a mask here. We love the masks for some reason. Turns out what you can do with that is instead of getting a simple photo, you actually get a 4-dimensional photo. So it's like a 2D array of 2D images. Now, this is technical, but what this means is that we've eliminated one component of the camera. It turns out that a single light-filled photograph, one exposure, can be refocused to any plane. Right? So normally you have to choose the F number given the lighting conditions, but you give up depth of field. But now you can actually have a very large aperture, but also an extended depth of field. And so what this means is that we can now remove one component of the camera, which is the focus ring. There's no reason for autofocus to even exist now. The consumer doesn't even need to choose the plane of focus because after the fact they can have any one they want. And so that's sort of the theme we're going on. And that direction of research is continuing. But I think it's not very inspired to say, hey, let's just put some things in different planes of a camera. Let's just completely rethink what a camera is. And so here I'll go very quickly, because I have the yellow light already. One thing we're doing is looking at the propagation of light itself. So a normal camera, when you take an exposure, it's some fraction of a second, like a thousandth of a second, maybe up to 1 second. What if you could actually measure light on the order of billionths or trillionths of a second? And so it turns out we can do this in the laboratory. We take femtosecond lasers, which were actually used 10 years ago in chemistry to win a Nobel Prize. Now we're using femtosecond lasers to actually illuminate scenes, and we have incredibly high-speed cameras that can actually see the multiple bounces of light. So if you point one of these cameras at a door, you can actually track the light as it bounces around a room, and you can actually take a photograph of a door and see what's on the other side. So you can literally see around corners with this technique. Now, it might be interesting to invade someone's privacy with this, but it would also be useful to look at search and rescue, medical imaging applications, or safety. And so I think this is a more dramatic look at what a camera could become. And so one thing that came out of all this work on cameras is we realized that the capture process is certainly not evolved much in the last 100 years, but even more so, displays have barely changed, right? I mean, we still have two-dimensional displays. In fact, they've gotten worse. The dynamic range of LCDs is much worse than these beautiful prints we spoke about earlier. And so I think one thing we're also trying to do in our lab are use similar tricks to overcome limitations of display technology. And so for the students in the room, you've probably seen a lot of this already, right? Our displays are no longer passive. We can interact with them directly. We have multi-touch on the iPhone and the iPad and now the iPad 2. And also, especially for the students, we have gesture-based interfaces like the Wii and the Microsoft Kinect. So these are allowing us to interact with the photographs directly. But more importantly is we also have lighting-sensitive displays. And this is sort of a subtle point. If you take your smartphone outside, the display actually becomes brighter. And as you go into a dark room like this, it dims. And this is to save battery life. Well, we decided to try to take this idea to its logical conclusion. And again, at the Media Lab, we like ripping apart off-the-shelf stuff. And so my collaborator and I actually took a bunch of LCD monitors, ripped them open, did some basic operations, and found a very simple liquid crystal panel. And so what this lets you do is it's like a programmable overhead transparency. And it turns out if you take one of these and put a large film plane behind it, the same size as the screen, you can accomplish something that 1984 said would be great, which is you can make a display that can also take a picture. And not only one picture, but actually this display becomes equivalent to an array of cameras. And so I can't go into the technical details, but it's basically a thin LCD screen like you'd have on an iPad, only here we've ripped one apart and built this bite-eye screen. And this lets you do something which is sort of interesting, which is you can do multi-touch interaction. But the second your finger leaves the screen, you're tracking it in 3 dimensions. And so because we have multiple cameras effectively. But here you can see there actually aren't any cameras visible. And so I think this is another way the medium is changing. It's becoming highly interactive. Now that we have Microsoft Connect and iPads, this demo may not be overwhelming. This was a couple years ago before those things were out. I think one thing that is interesting that we can do is we can do relightable displays. So it's a little difficult to see, but I'm holding a flashlight, pointing it at this special LCD panel. And as I wave it around, it's measuring the real light falling on the screen and then propagating that into the virtual world, right? So imagine you have a photograph and it was taken in a dark room. Well, you actually look at the screen and you just shine a flashlight at the screen and it relights the photograph correctly. And so this is an idea of relightable photos. So again, I'm low on time, so I'll just point out all of these games we've been playing. It turns out basically the key idea behind this is we're introducing masks into optical systems. And one thing you can do with that, and this is pretty technical, you can make 3D displays that don't require glasses, right? So if you go to Best Buy, you can, or you buy one of these Nintendo's 3DS that's coming out in America in March, you can see a stereoscopic image, right? Binocular stereo without glasses now, but it's actually rather dim and low quality. And so we found ways to make actually 3D displays without glasses. And then this game has just opened up a lot in the last few years. So we talked earlier about the photographic print. One thing we'd like to do is, I talked about this BiDi screen that uses LCD panels to monitor the light, but we can actually make passive devices that respond to light. So we can make basically a photographic print that consists of a transparency and some lenses. And it turns out that what this can do is it can react to light from behind, right? So what you can do is you can print a photograph now and put it in your windowsill. And here this is showing the time of day. And this is completely passive. There's no electronics, no power. And what happens is as the sun moves, you can see that the shadows and lighting in the photograph are correctly captured, right? So we've changed the photographic process to record all this information, which is much more than a traditional photo. And then we've changed the print to actually allow you to view this after the fact. So it's sort of a 21st century version of stained glass. So moving ahead, if I can. There we go. So I'm low on time. So I just want to show you a couple other things we've done. We talked a lot about Google and the idea of privacy and Street View. One project we had in our lab, and I'll do this very quickly, is to make a barcode that you can't perceive as a human. So here we have a small dot. It just looks like a little LED next to some large barcodes. But it turns out when you take a photograph out of focus, this dot actually becomes resolved. And you can see inside the bokeh an actual message. And so our hope is that you could, for instance, put these on the front of stores. And this could contain a small text file or information embedded in it that basically give certain permissions to the photographs taken at that location. And then, we've done a lot in this space. We have another project where we use, basically it's like a hardware app store. Our idea is now that we have software app stores on phones, what you should do is you should go to CVS and buy a cheap attachment for your phone. And for instance here, by just putting a simple optical element over a smartphone, and you basically play this little video game, you get your eyeglasses prescription without a doctor, and actually more accurately than a doctor can give you. And so we're actually trying this out in clinics in India right now. And so now I'd just like to very quickly show you a little bit about the Media Lab, and less than I planned because I've certainly taken more than enough time. So the Media Lab, if you don't know, is within the School of Architecture and Planning. Despite all this engineering, it's actually in an artistic department. It has a graduate program in media arts and sciences. You can see the breakdown there, but I think if you enjoy this sort of mixture between hardware and software hacking and art, please apply to the master's program. And so I think I'll leave it at that. So thank you.
Could I just pick up on that last thought? I would love
Sure.
it if you could talk a little bit about the kinds of collaborations that are going on at the Media Lab and that you would like to be going on at the Media Lab. What's your vision of it?
Right.
Of art and science?
So I'm sort of a newcomer in a way. I've been around the Media Lab for about 2 years, but only as a visitor in passing, and now I'm officially there as a researcher. It's an interesting place. We have a broad set, at least in terms of the graduate students, we have very broad disciplines. There are people such as myself who have formal backgrounds in mathematics and physics and engineering, but we also have students with just pure graphic design, because a lot of our work is more about inventing the future. That's sort of, if we had a motto, that would be it. Right. And so we try to construct actual demos like you saw there, working demos to sort of showcase how it is, our vision for what the future should become. And so I think to do that well, it's not enough just to show the technological aspects of an invention, to say, hey, I can put this mask in a camera and do things with it. You need to show things are compelling. And more recently, we've actually taken on collaborators at the MIT Museum to try to develop public exhibits and to try to show in an artistic aspect, in a compelling way, our vision of the future.
Can you give an example?
Well, we're still trying to figure that out. So I'd appreciate any feedback that people have on the work that we're doing. So, a lot of the initial projects we're thinking about are more about telepresence. Like if you have a museum that's located on the other side of the country, you can use some of this advanced technology to build a teleconference link that feels like you're looking through a window. So that's actually one of the inspirations for my work. Gabriel Lippmann, who's a Nobel laureate in 1908, one of the co-inventors of color photography, he has this statement about how photography should become like a window, that you can walk in front of it and see perspective and see the whole dynamic range of day. And I think that's really where we're trying to go with this work, is to make the photographic process as if looking through a window into the past.
I'm curious to know about the methodology that you use in the lab. How do you decide where to place your energy and your priorities? Is there some mission that directs your research? Because you seem to have a lot of different really interesting, provocative things going at once.
Right. So thank you. So that's one of the unique aspects of the Media Lab, is our only real mandate is to try to show something compelling. Justify your existence, right? So we use a corporate sponsored model. So I don't know, for those of you students certainly professors will appreciate this. We actually don't write that many grants. We actually go and find companies, basically based on our brand name, that will come to the lab and say, hey, you're doing a lot of interesting work on displays, for instance, a display manufacturer, and they can basically pay for a membership. And this membership allows them access to the patents that we produce, but also to the students. And so oftentimes they will send researchers to actually collaborate with us. And so the end result, I think, that's great about this model is that once you get these funds from the companies, they're actually not allowed to give direct funding. They can't say, I want you to only work on this project. And so as a result, we have many interesting things. For instance, believe it or not, we have a group led by Todd Mockover that does operas. They actually produced an opera in Monaco. One morning I saw the president of Spain, I guess, or something in the lab. I mean, we see these visitors all the time, and it's all based on the funding model. I think that's an historic choice the Media Lab made.
What about the conversations that come out of what do you talk about in the lab? What are the sort of philosophical implications of what it is you're developing? Do you consider all aspects of a particular innovation? Or do you just sort of charge right into it and try to get there fastest and first?
There's definitely a lot of the classic academia, fastest and first. Like, there's certainly a lot of these ideas I presented. You sit through presentations like this at a technical conference and you say, okay, I know what's next. And I better do it before someone else, not only to get the patent, but just the accolades of doing it first. I think if we think about technology and the broader philosophical implications, it's more that we want to be as disruptive as possible. Whenever we're judging, should I do project A or B? The project that's most disruptive, objectionable on ethical grounds? No. I mean,
which one would that be here?
Yeah. So here, my work, being a newcomer, I don't think there's a lot of provocative, objectionable things that are coming out of it. I really enjoyed this issue we had earlier about Google and whether, it's invading our privacy or ruining the spontaneity of life. I mean, I think that's what the Media Lab hopes to do, is to have a technology which really affects the composition and culture.
So you want to create more problems, so then you can solve them.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Very, very healthy environment to work in. I'm curious about that chip or code that you could zoom in on and determine whether or not you give permission for being photographed. Right. Can you talk more about that project?
Yeah. So it's I think a lot of our ideas. You mentioned earlier how we come up with ideas. We have a lot of broad backgrounds. We have biologists and scientists and all sorts of things. And in this specific project, it's a pretty simple idea. Basically, this whole system where we have a little tiny chip plus a camera basically makes an enormous microscope. I mean, when you write down the mathematics and you look at the optics, it is in fact a microscope. It's just that the part in between is open air instead of a closed tube. And so that's sort of the original idea we had, was let's see if we can make a barcode based on this principle. And so the goal was really to make a barcode that's hidden to a user. You've probably seen a lot of people have tried. It's very popular overseas, especially in Asia, to have QR codes on everything, right? So you go to a hotel lobby and you want to check in. You scan a QR code with your smartphone, or you see a movie poster and you're interested in entering a competition. You take a photo of the QR code. That hasn't really caught on here, and it could be that advertising is so incredibly expensive, we're not willing to give up real estate on a poster for a big, giant QR code that basically only carries information for the computer. And so that's when sort of the philosophical and commercial aspects came to bear on this project. We said, we think we can do this. By repurposing a microscope, we can build a little tiny chip that's basically like the specimen in a microscope slide plus the first lens of a microscope. So it's this little tiny optical element that basically is a barcode, but it's in angle. It's not distributed over a spatial region. It distributes the light in angle. And then the rest of the optics, the camera is actually taking that angular information and converting it back to a magnified image.
I see.
And so that you can see this interplay where, basically someone said, oh, this would be great. It's a commercial prospect where we can hide a barcode so that only a machine can read it and not a human. Great. And then biologists were inspired by this. And so there's this sort of interplay. And then those ideas they go both directions. Some people in the lab are taking this project and trying to improve biological microscopy to get better scientific imagery. And others are trying to commercialize this idea.
And I think some of the students and photographers in the room are particularly curious about the work you're doing with relighting the object by flashing the flashlight on it and developing, what did you call it, relighting?
Yeah, relighting is yeah.
And also the ability to break down the focus plane so that you don't have to have the focus ring anymore?
Right.
Where are we in that development? How are we close?
So I think so we sort of call this, it's a technical term, but epsilon photography. This idea that basically a modern camera, like I mentioned, sensor, lens, and aperture, there's this range of parameters you need to choose. What is my F number? What is my exposure time? And our initial goal, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, was to make all of these choices irrelevant. That when you take a photograph, any combination of choices you could have made is possible to recreate after the fact. And also you can do strange things. For instance, something a traditional camera can't do is have 2 independent planes of focus. Right? So I have a diver in the foreground and an interesting poster in the back, and I want both during the same exposure. And so that sort of idea came out of that.
So you're not taking away choice, you're adding choice.
That was our initial hope. I mean, when you think about this formally as a communication system, you're gathering much more information, right? So your file size is definitely increasing to do these tricks, right? Like when I showed the photograph that you could shine a flashlight at, that file is much more than a traditional photograph. And so I think this is the tension is basically if we're going to have these more flexible photos that can be manipulated in post, we have to pay by gathering much more data at the time of capture, which all these tricks are assisting in doing that efficiently. But at the same time, hard disk sizes are phenomenal compared to what I had as a child. I mean, my first computer had 20 megabytes, I think. You had to delete a program to install a program. And
so what market do you imagine this will end up in?
So I guess that's the question I'd have for you is whether or not this flexibility is actually necessary. To what degree does it enable artistic process? Because probably the market we're most targeting are novices, right? So basically the camera of the future, you already have it. Of course, it's a cell phone. There's no reason to carry anything more than one device, right? As your work has demonstrated, right? We need one fetish, and that's going to be the smartphone. And so that phone, of course, should have as few buttons as possible. And we've already sort of reached that. It has one button, take a photo now. It's logical to think that we'll just eliminate the shutter as well. So we'll just take photos all the time of our lives. And a lot of research groups are looking at what you would do with that. Basically substituting, you have a continuous video stream so you can recall anything at any time.
I think I can safely say, and I can speak for many of the people here, that we would like to have as much choice as we can, and we don't want to have it substituted altogether.
Right.
So if you can do anything about that and allow for that hybrid practice that was being addressed earlier, I think that is the artistic toolbox that we feel most comfortable with.
Right. So I think that's certainly one of our short-term goals is to make a camera where it's as simple as possible to use. So right now when you only have one button. You take an auto exposure and you're done, but you have to automatically set all these parameters. And so what's nice now is we've developed cameras where all those parameters are sampled. We're still going to give you one photo, but if it happens to be a poor photo, you can go now fix it, right? Because I think the mistake is to try to capture everything. That's sort of how Hollywood works, right? When you produce a blockbuster movie, you capture the actors on a green screen or a blue screen, so you don't even have to choose scene yet. You can delay that decision, right? And you can delay now the plane of focus. You can delay the lighting choices. Everything is delayed, which now means your editors and your post-production team are the ones creating the movie. And so I think we've just moved it downstream. And so the goal now is to try to develop a camera that not only captures everything, but then uses that data to create the ultimate, Ansel Adams photograph you wanted to see. And so
I don't know about that.
That would be the hope.
I mean, there's a question of quality here that everybody's always concerned about.
Right.
The hyper-real and the hyper-visual is not ever going to look like an Ansel Adams photograph that was made with traditional optics.
Right. So what's interesting is by capturing this broader set of information, I guess looking at what researchers might tackle. In the next 10 years, I think we will develop cameras that are much more flexible in terms of sampling all these parameters. so that technical knowledge is unnecessary for photography. But then this higher level of how to produce a beautiful print. You know, if I go to the Sistine Chapel and take a photo, can I make it something approaching, or at least having the power of a professional photo? And, you know, I think that's at some point a doable prospect, because it's essentially a machine learning problem. You can give me every expert photo ever, and I can learn the style. And people have done this. I can convert my photo.
I know, it is like a language.
Yeah.
I defer that. I come from that last generation where we actually had to learn both analog and digital, and we're getting to a point now where that style or language of photography that you're talking about can be mimicked but not really known because they haven't had to actually do it.
Right.
Because we'll no longer have those tools to achieve it.
Right. So I
if
definitely...
you take those away from us, we won't know the language.
Right. And so
Really.
I do feel, not addressing, you know, artists, I think, want as full, as you said, creative control as possible. I guess much of my work is about helping novices produce much more compelling results than their own training, right? And so I think a product like iMovie is a good example, where before that existed, the ability to create a video of your vacation or some event, you know, if you tried to edit it together, you just play the VCR tape to your family, right? And now you can do all this editing very simply, even a novice. And I think photography is moving in the same direction. For instance, Adobe has projects where you load in your photo and you get a menu and it shows 3 photos. And I say, I would like it to move more in this direction. I'd like it to have a painterly style, a stimpling style, or this. And it just branches this tree, and it's you know, degrading the technical aspects behind this, but it's also making
style and art are two different things.
So it's creating. So yeah, and I agree. I'm just saying this is the direction I think the technical side to make photography more accessible to the novices that it'll move in.
Okay.
But for the experts, that's what I'm unaware. That's what I'm not sure is.
Yeah, I mean, there's a different market you have
Right.
here, obviously.
Right.
Experts, I don't know if we're all experts, but we all have a certain, I think, dedication to a certain quality that we have learned to recognize and appreciate. And it's something that's very felt. It can't be artificial. And I think that's why there's been this great divide between those sort of Luddites and those who are rushing to the future, and we're trying to meet somewhere in between so we can come up with an outcome that is appreciated by all parties.
Right.
And we're still struggling to get there, because what you're talking about sounds so crisp and perfect. And we talked a lot about perfection this morning in terms of publishing, and I just can't help but think about imperfection and where it's being lost.
Right. And that really is our goal, right? Is this real, and then hopefully at some point hyper-real is our goal as well, right? I talked about the mantis shrimp. To me, it would be very interesting if cameras actually captured all this information, and so that you could produce photographs that show this hidden world that we don't see, right? Where you can see the magnetic field lines that birds use to navigate, right? Because birds can actually see them, we can't. And so I think...
But why do we need to see that? I'm not a bird.
Certainly... Seeing the hidden world, I think,
Just
is
because
compelling.
we'll get a patent for it, really.
Yeah.
Okay. I appreciate that. So what do you think about the state of photography today, from an artistic point of view? Do you have any opinions about art photography?
I'm certainly not qualified to speak on that. I guess that would be something I'd defer to you on. I guess maybe...
Do you look at photography within its many forms and reality? I mean, we are a many-headed monster.
Right.
In the world of photography.
I think...
Because you talk about photography as one single entity, but in
Right.
fact we're many.
We definitely look at it on the technical side as the photographic process, as Michael was saying earlier, that you are translating, basically at a fundamental level, you have a point in space, which is the center of projection. You have a sensor, you're creating a perspective projection geometrically, and you would like to record as much information about the light rays as possible. That's how we see photography. We are making a visual record. What you do with that after the fact, that's something that we haven't explored much, other than how you might display that information.
Right.
And so I guess that would be my question for you, is that, if you have these ultimate cameras that record absolutely everything.
The ultimate camera.
Yeah. If you have the point it's converging to, that really I put this little microscopic device at some point in space, and it really records everything. 360 degrees around, all colors, everything about the world. How does it really assist you in depicting a place or a feeling?
I feel overwhelmed
Yeah.
and anxious, and I'll have to get back to you on that, because that's a whole project. I mean, it's exciting as an artist who, my partner and I have years sort of worked addressing those questions that come up from all of these inventions that occur. And I would hope that there are still people out there in the next generation of artists who are grappling with these same things in different ways. And that's our job as artists who take a critical position in the world to call into question some of this rush to the future. Right. So I can't answer that so quickly, but give me a couple of years.
Right. So I guess another aspect I see sort of on the outside, my advisor, Ramesh Raskar, who leads our group, he has an interesting claim, which is, especially for novices, there's almost no point in taking a photo anymore. And I think Michael got to this before, which is you go to the Pantheon, you go to some famous site, that photo's already been taken, and probably by someone with more skill and a better camera than you. And so all you really want is a photo of you.
Better, all these subjective stuff.
Right.
You're talking about like the perfect picture was already taken better than you.
Right, but I guess the fact that we do have this second copy of the world, this digital world, and the Flickr trove, how does that really change the process, the fact that every place can already be seen?
Now, the act of shooting is an act of experiencing, and to look and to be are two different things, and I think that is something that people want to hold on to. So, I don't know. To go on to Flickr is an act of looking,
right?
And just certifying that it exists, maybe, but we're not sure.
Right.
Yeah, but to stop photographing because of the ultimate camera, that's something else. Where are you going with that exactly? Do we really need to get there? It sounds like such an endpoint that is only in science fiction.
The ultimate camera?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like we're pretty close. We're taking essentially a photo of everything on Earth updated at a monthly
But you're
time
saying
scale.
because of that, then we don't need to have photography programs teaching students to make.
Oh no, that's
subjective
definitely not
points
my
of view.
claim. I think
okay.
that's the territory left to humans.
Okay.
We have automated the technical aspects. We're making a photographic record of the world. What that record's used for, is now the question. What are we actually using all this information to generate?
As you were saying earlier when we had lunch about compositing and editing and selecting and making sense of it.
Right.
Because it's raw material at this point.
Right, and I don't know if any students here, I guess that would be, looking at all the work we've seen, are there students that basically do the photography on Flickr? That you go to a site, you search for some location, that is your art. That is the data you should work with.
Yeah, it's the compositing and the editing.
Right, and that seems to be the 21st century challenge, is how do we, as an engineer, how do we sift through this trove of information? If everyone is flooding Facebook and Flickr and Google is producing a copy of the world every minute, every second, who knows, at some scale, how do we actually interpret all that information? And what is
that our job or your job?
We're definitely not on the interpretation side.
Should we take questions?
Any questions? There's one blue shirt in the middle.
I think it's all very amazing, and I think really you're scaring the hell out of everybody because
that's always we want to be provocative.
It's good,
even if
but
we're wrong.
I think it's because everybody sees how when you talk about the way you can preset and figure out the style of how a photographer works, it's like this is distracting. Okay, it's like people are seeing, that if you can just reproduce a beautiful photograph by measuring the data of the light, then it's just like it's making people feel even more isolated or outcast than they do now by the technology of being able to if everybody just having a good camera, being able to take a good photograph. Now it's like you can just pump out the good photograph right away without any kind of anything. And I know that's scary, but I think you're fundamentally working from the same aspect of artists in that you're fascinated by how liberating it can be to understand the way light works and the way you can create this new thing, the options you have from the technology. So I think it's a good thing, but I don't think that you should be able to leave it open for people like it's preset. Just don't make it preset. Make it just as explorative as it is for you and your engineers in the lab to be able to take apart the camera and see what it's going to do. Minus, we're not going to get a broken camera. We're going to have a camera that has these options. So I think if you leave it there, where it's more open, it's like having paintbrushes on a table, and people can use them and pick them up. Not everybody has the same skill. It's like you leave those options open to people, but don't make it so, preset. That's just the thing. That'll cause like an uproar in the art world.
Do you have a question?
So, no.
No.
I think just following also the Google presentation this morning, I'm sitting here and thinking, I mean, who are we kidding? Google cannot see everything by far means, and will never see everything. And also the kind of idea of the everything is such, for me, sounds like such a unreflected, hysterical reflex to deal with the limitations of our knowledge that will always be limited. And what I don't see, which actually scares me more than the kind of technology, is the unreflectedness in the reality of the limits of our knowledge on the side of technological evolution. It's the artists who are kind of giving a philosophical reflection on the limits of our knowledge and how we deal with that responsibly. And then there are the technology guys who go with bigger, and then we're going to make the best camera who can see everything. I mean, we all know that's completely ridiculous. And you know that too, because what is everything is completely relative.
Well,
so
definitely light,
to...
electromagnetic spectrum is a well-defined quantity that you can capture.
You can, but you also know, as somebody who comes from technology, is what we understand the electromagnetic spectrum to be has changed gradually by what we understand about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you are constantly aware of the limitation of the knowledge that you're working with. But then there's this kind of talk as if we can see everything, make a copy of the world. Like, what is the world? It's not what Google represents, certainly. So it's not a copy, it's not even a fragment of what the world is. So I would like to see a little bit more of a reflective kind of language coming from the side of technology, and not only leave it to the artists in terms of this talking about the absolute, which doesn't exist. We all know that.
Right. So I think as a technologist, as an engineer, right, you look at any device, and it's like you go to Best Buy, and it has a list of bullet points, right? So you see the iPad, now you see the iPad 2, the bullet points have improved. That's sort of in a short term how technology works. We say, okay, what's the limitation of this device? Let's get rid of it. And now let's get rid of the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing, until there's nothing left, and we have a device that captures, to the given task, all the information we need, right? And so, for instance, if you look at telecommunication, you can study, what frequencies are present in a human voice. That's all you need to transmit. We can do that accurately. That technology's done. We solved that problem, move on. And so, it's difficult for technologists to stop that. No one can stop that process. That's the magic of technology. That's what defines humans, is that we use tools to improve our world, to see more, to see what's hidden. And so I think, if you look at Google Earth today, you need to remember, Keyhole, where it came from originally. I saw that for the first time in a museum maybe 7-8 years ago, right? 20 years ago, it wasn't even possible. And so I think, just that we're on the surface now, I mean, the amount of data online, right? People will likely start wearing cameras. We'll have videos captured almost everywhere, refreshing daily. So I definitely think that we are approaching the point where we have this visual record continually made of the world. Now, whether it's complete or perfect in any way is certainly not true, but it's growing every day, and I think that's what people are concerned about, the privacy aspects of that, the uniqueness of human knowledge and of human experience.
But there's also politics involved with what is visible and what is not visible, and what we can recognize with our brains as something that is legible back to us. Philosophy has taught that to us for years, that we continuously define of what is legible, and that it's not like there is no kind of general idea of what vision is. Vision continuously changes. It doesn't just expand like a big balloon that gets bigger and bigger and bigger, but it changes, and it changes around of politics. It changes of what is recognizable, what we kind of consider safe to recognize, what we don't consider safe to recognize. So the questions are so much bigger, and they're about politics, and they're about power, and they're about capital, and they're about philosophy. It's like such a big field, and I know that's not what you are particularly interested in, but I would appreciate in the language that is created around this technology to reflect that awareness that I'm sure you have, being a studied person as you are.
Most people who work on technology want to be agnostic to the larger implications. They want to be neutral to the outcome, right? If you look at the atomic bomb, they were inventing a device that could power the whole world or destroy it, right? And it's not for the scientists to, color their papers and their speech with their personal beliefs of how this technology, unless they have moral objections to the technology, right? And so I think in this case, in photography, we're pursuing a goal which is, is well defined. I mean, in terms of mathematics and science, creating a photograph is a well-defined problem. You're capturing a part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and the information contained in that actually is a formal quantity, which is known as entropy. And we can actually quantify the degree to which we're capturing it. So there's no subjective around that, the definition of what you're recording, to within the limits of current human and scientific knowledge. So I guess, how would you like scientists to change how they approach their work? I mean, this headlong rush to progress is your concern, or is it that they're not taking the time to reflect on their own implications? Because that's the role of society to judge. I mean, we as technologists have limited creativity. We don't actually know what will become of our work, right? A lot of times work that was done 100 years ago, the person died, didn't even know how critical it was, right? It was published in a vacuum and then got resurrected based on newer technology.
There's a question all the way in the left side.
Hello, it's on? Okay, great. I have a short question, and my friend has a short question for Douglas. I'm wondering what you think about the pros and cons of repurposing consumer electronics as opposed to creating something from scratch, particularly in light of what you were saying about the focus of your work or the Media Lab's work making disruptive technology. Why repurpose? That's my short question.
So the short answer is that it's easier. So easier and cheaper. So if you have one of these, crazy ideas like I want to build a camera that works this way, I mean, we don't actually. I mean, we have a lot of skills, but we don't have that, infinite ability to fabricate things. That's something Richard talked about earlier. Is the ability to make things, right? And in our basement we have, vacuum forming machines and laser cutting machines and robotic arms and all these things. But at the end of the day, building an LCD monitor, right, costs hundreds of millions of dollars to build this fabrication facility and all these other things. And so at the Media Lab, a lot of the work you'll see is repurposing existing technology because it's close enough that you can sort of bend it to what you need. And so on a shoestring budget, you can show sort of a cutting-edge idea and sort of influence the technology. So in a lot of cases, like this relightable display, we'll build it using something we bought at Best Buy for a couple $100, and then a company will come by and say, that looks great, we're going to actually fabricate this for you. And so it's your leverage. It's your way to sort of get into a larger industry. So it's cheaper and faster.
We'll take one more question from the audience in the front over here.
Hi. So very intriguing everything what you're saying, and I just wanted to get back to a couple of the comments that our people said about the fear, because that's what it cuts my attention, the fear of the photographer of what the media is going to be in a couple years. I applaud technology. I'm a photographer. I think that at the end of the day is your creativity behind the tool. What they're doing is just a tool. It's up to us to actually make sense of it. I mean, when photography was created, some scientists came up with the idea, okay, I'm going to put an f-stop and I'm going to put the ISO because that's the way supposedly, it should work so I can get the image. They could have not created that, and what would have had happened? We would have had another tool that probably we would have maybe kind of different art. So I think it's how you reinterpret what technology is giving you. I think what you guys are doing, I don't believe it's ridiculous to think of the absolute. I think what you're talking about is like the ideal photograph that people would want of a location, the ideal world, but it's up to every person to interpret that in their own way. Like when he's talking about you can capture everything, it's like capture everything as like the commodity of advertising. When you go on a cruise, they tell you you're going to have so much fun. It's that idea, the commercial part of it. But it's up to I think artists to actually, take that critical eye and take the tool and show the world there's another way to look at things. So I think people get too caught up in the technology, and they're not looking into what can I do with this technology? You know, there's always the line between science and art, and I feel like they need to meet up to go forward. And I think, personally, the people that don't want to necessarily undertake that, they're going to stay behind because technology is not going to stop. And as you know, I think what is very important, we can take the past and bring it to the future, you know, in a nice way, but we cannot like not follow the future because it's already gone. So that's the only thing I wanted to say. I think that this is really interesting and it's opening the eyes of like a lot of people, I feel.
Do you guys want to respond to that? Or?
No, I think that was very well put. Thank you.
Okay. I think that, are you guys up for, oh, okay. Well, we should end.
Okay.
But if there are other questions, obviously, they'll be here, you know, to answer in person.